of our African Digital Diplomacy Introductory Seminars. We did have our virtual launch last Wednesday, and today we delve into the seminars proper. And we will have two eminent and very well-placed scholar practitioners helping us to launch. Today's today's session is focused on the foundational skills and competencies that an African digital diplomat, and indeed any diplomat in the world, will need to even begin to be effective in a networked digital diplomatic world. We'll start off with Mr. Lauren Hurst, whom I will introduce very briefly shortly, and then have a short break of 10 minutes after about 40 minutes. And then we'll go to Professor Corneliu Biola from Oxford University for a similar session. And we should hope then to wrap up just before 4 p.m. South African time, I must say, because we are all in a virtual world and time differences might be fairly confusing. So that being said, I would like us then to go straight into the first presentation without much ado, hoping that we're all comfortable where we are. Our screens are fine. The volume on, as we speak, we are audible enough and so forth. Lauren Hurst is coming first, and I would like to introduce Lauren as a senior consultant and new media producer for TechniArts Engineering LLC, which is based, I suppose, in Washington, D.C. And I'll just say a few words about Lauren. I'll not go deep into his bio because we have it as one of the resources, but just to say very quickly that Lauren is a public affairs and communications professional with an interdisciplinary background. For over 25 years, Lauren has conceived, created, and managed public affairs, instructional, and marketing initiatives for government agencies, new enterprises, business associations, and non-profits in domestic and international contexts. He has managed online communities in Brussels, coordinated fundraising efforts for clean energy and biotech enterprises, represented business interests to governments in Europe and the United States, and trained US diplomatic staff here in Africa. His passions are sustainability, education, and leveraging technology for sound policy and business decisions. And I could go on, but I think it will be only fair that we give Lauren the opportunity to set us off. So Lauren, it's all yours, and happy to listen to you.
Great, thank you, Bob. I appreciate the invitation to be here today. It's always a pleasure for me to work with the African continent and with African diplomats. One of the greatest memories and some of the best accomplishments I've had have been working with African audiences, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my presentation today. Bob just gave you a little bit of my background and my bio. And what you can expect to hear from me today, I'm going to share a few slides with you. Okay, and I'm going to go through some of the principles that we should be thinking about when we are deciding how to use technology in a public diplomacy, in a digital diplomacy context. I will also give you a couple of examples that I have worked on, specifically podcasting and audio production and virtual programming, which I am working on now. Now, for everybody who is watching, I would like to go through my presentation. I'm going to go through it fairly quickly because I'd like to be able to take as many questions and have a discussion with you to make sure that I'm answering your questions and giving you the information that you need. All of the materials, including my presentation notes that I'm showing to you here now, are in the resources folder. So you don't need to take notes or write down a lot of what I say because everything I'm saying is already written down and it's in the folder for you. So I would encourage you just to listen to what I'm saying, and if you do have questions, go ahead and write your questions down, and we can get to those a little bit later. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to share my screen. We're going to go through a couple of principles that I like to use when we're thinking about how do you deploy technology in a public diplomacy context. So let me share my screen with you here. Where'd my window go? 1 second. Give me a moment. Okay, here we go. Sorry, my screen disappeared. Okay, here we go. Everybody should see that. So the first principle when we're discussing how do we start? You know, where do you start when deciding to build a digital diplomacy program? Now, the following principles that I'm going to tell you about are going to answer the questions. First of all, how do you deploy the technology? Okay, how are you going to use it? A second principle is also going to answer what are the investments that you need to make in terms of the hardware, in terms of the software, and also in terms of the training for staff, because the training and the skill sets are very important. And the third thing is, how do you organize your technology for long-term sustainability? Because when you do make those investments, you want to make sure you're doing it in a right way so that you can get as much value out of that over the long term. Okay, so here's the first principle that I'd like to talk about. Build your tech around your strategic objectives and not the other way around. A lot of times when we see people who are just getting into building a digital diplomacy program, they think about the technology first and think, okay, all these great tools, you know, we need to get the latest and the greatest technology, but really you want to keep things simple. Okay, so what you really want to do is start with identifying the core basic strategic objectives of your public diplomacy program. Okay, and this goes to things, for example, like who is your audience? You know, what is the demographic that you're looking for? There are so many technology options out there. How do you choose? And that's the real question that we want to get to with this principle. It's easy to get overwhelmed because there's so many technology options out there. Just with virtual programming, off the top of my head, I can name probably 5 or 6 platforms that you can choose from. Each one of them basically do the same thing, but each also have a specific process and specific capabilities that you need to keep in mind. It's very easy to get overwhelmed when you take a look at all the technology options. So you do want to start with your marketing objectives and your public diplomacy objectives. And the way that you do this is you proceed as you would with any marketing, public diplomacy, or business planning process. So the first thing is to research your target audience. You know, how old are they? How are they accessing the messaging that you're sending out? It's very important also to understand that your audiences these days, they have the ability to go from one platform to another with a single click of the mouse or a tap of their finger on their phone. So it is very important to identify who your audience is and how they are accessing your messaging. Now, another thing to consider is that part of the audience research process, you have to understand that they are also your greatest asset. And one of the things you want to do is build communities around your messaging. You need to be able to, again, find out how your audience is accessing your messaging. Is it through a mobile phone or a desktop? What type of content do they prefer? Is it text? Is it video? Is it audio? All of those things are going to be forming the basis for what type of technology you're going to be using and what type of investments you need to make. So let's go to the second principle, which is in digital diplomacy, more technology is not necessarily better. Okay, and this builds on the first principle of getting a better idea of who your target market is. When you clearly define your objectives, those objectives will basically tell you what you need in terms of making the investments for that software and that hardware. Now, there are many technology tools these days that are very low cost. For example, you can actually go online right now, and there's plenty of tools that are free that you can use for image editing, for video editing, for even building a website. So you don't need to make a whole lot of large, expensive investments to get a digital diplomacy program up and running. And again, this goes back to, how do you know what those tools are? You need to go and find out how your audience is accessing your messaging. And that will tell you what type of tools that you need. Now, it's very important to go through the first principle and go to principle number 2, because technology can be complicated. It does take some specialized knowledge to manage it well and to do it efficiently. And so, again, if you are going out and just looking at all the technology and you're enamored with all the new tools, it can get overwhelming very quickly. You want to keep things as simple as possible because the technology changes all the time and it's tough to keep up. You also have to remember that you don't want to spend all your time managing the technology. You want to use the technology to get your messaging out. That's another key principle right there. So let's go to principle number 3. And that is that technology advances and changes constantly, and you need to act accordingly. Now, this is really about skill sets. This is, again, not about having a particular piece of technology in front of you, because the technology changes constantly. You need to have the skill sets to be adaptable as the technology changes, as your audience changes. For example, one year people may be looking at video as their main source of content. After that, they may migrate and adapt to using text or maybe using audio for radio stations. These are things that change, and you need to be able to go where your audience is, because, again, the audience has so much freedom and so much power in the market now. They can change and go wherever they want, again, with the click of a mouse. So you need to be able to adapt to them and then adapt your skills for production, for management of the technology as those requirements change. Okay. And again, really the first thing to do is to find out what your objectives are, and that will guide you in terms of what type of technology you want to use. The ability to learn is a key skill set, and the ability to be adaptable and to constantly learn is going to serve you well as you build your public diplomacy programs. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about podcasting and audio production, which is something I did with Africa quite a bit. Before I go on to that, a further element of principle 3 is that the technology allows you to be creative. And this is what we did with our Africa audio programs. So what I'd like to do, I'm going to go to one more slide and I'll explain this. Audio production and podcasting. So in Africa, we use podcasting and audio production to reach otherwise disconnected audiences. When I first started the podcasting program at State Department, it was actually the first time we had ever done this. I remember the story that I was working in Brussels at the US mission to the EU at the time, and I was coming back to the United States. And I was contacted by the State Department here in Washington, and they said, we want to get into podcasting and social media, and you're the only guy that we know that understands how this stuff works and has actually used it in a professional context. And they said, would you like to create and consult on managing our program? And I said, sure, it sounds like fun. So that's what we did. Now, over time, we did build out the technology infrastructure that we needed, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. It was actually quite simple. And another thing that we did is, again, we started with principle 1 when building this program. I sat down and I went to our different stakeholders and I said, what are we trying to accomplish with this? Who are we trying to reach? And then based on the answers to those questions, we built the technology around that. We built the editorial processes. We built the approval processes for the messaging, and we decided what type of content do we want to create. And essentially what I did for a long time was I took written text, whether these were news articles, whether they were ebooks or white papers or whatever it may be, I took that information and adapted it for an audio context. Okay, and so one of the most important things to do is to use your resources. Use the existing resources that you have and adapt those for a digital environment. I'm sure if you look around your office right now, you do have a lot of information about government policies, about a lot of the programs that you run. Those are all resources that you can use and adapt for either podcasting, audio production, or virtual programming that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, another thing that we did when I began the podcasting program was I did a lot of stakeholder engagement. There was a lot of education and training that needed to be done. And so I would go around to both my colleagues and also the leadership to explain to them how audio production and podcasting worked, and also what is the importance of this. Okay, and I would actually go out and say, well, our audiences in Africa or our audiences in Europe, this is how they're accessing the information. These are the trends in terms of how much people are going online to access audio files and podcasts. It's a growing context, and we need to be able to engage in that. And this is how we do that. So this is another thing that I would, as you're beginning your investments in technology and deploying those things, you need to be able to educate your stakeholders, your leadership, and your colleagues about how this works and about why this is important. Now, podcasting in the African context specifically was a perfect example of adapting technology for local uses. Now, podcasting itself refers to taking an audio file and putting it out on the internet. Okay, podcasting, you can download it onto your phone and you can listen to it whenever you like. Now, in Africa, that presented us with a challenge in some places specifically because internet penetration was very low and a lot of people did not have access to it. And so I talked to our colleagues and I said, well, how can we use audio and podcasting to reach some of those audiences? And through our discussions with local officials in the US embassies and also community partners, we found that, well, a lot of people in Africa are actually listening to the radio stations, to community radio stations. And I said, okay, let's try something. Let's produce some podcasts according to the specifications and the formats that our local partners have told us those audiences want. And why don't we go ahead and produce that content? We'll put it onto a CD and send it to the radio stations. And so we tried that a few times and we found out it worked very, very well. We were able to get some local community radio stations who would actually come to rely on our content and make it a core part of their programming. And so that was a very great success story for us. And again, that is something that when you're talking about technology, in that case, we were actually taking the technology and using it in a way that was really not technical at all. It was really a traditional type of mass communication using radio stations. But the technology allowed us to produce a lot of content. It allowed us to produce content on a regular basis and do it efficiently. And as we grew and as we deepened those relationships with our stakeholders, we found that it was really just a great partnership and a great success. We were able to reach a lot of people and a lot of audiences that otherwise would not be able to hear our messages. And so that was something that was very exciting to me. Now, what I'd like to show you now is what I used to produce that content. And before I do so, I just want to remind you that more technology is not necessarily better. You always want to keep things simple. And so this slide here, I ran the State Department podcasting program for 5 years for a global audience all over the world. We translated podcasts into 9 different languages, and I think I produced over 1,000 podcasts, essentially with the equipment that you see right there. So a laptop computer, a microphone, a pair of headphones, and at the bottom there, you see a mobile recorder that I would use on interviews when I would take out to people and interview them on site or at their offices. And that was really it. And all of that stuff you see right there is fairly low cost. The microphones, the computer obviously is a MacBook, and that's quite expensive, but you can get a laptop or any type of laptop with the audio editing software that will allow you to edit audio files. And that's really all I used. And so that was totally sufficient for what I needed. Another advantage to a setup like this is that it's mobile. I could put all of that in a bag and take it anywhere I wanted to. And in fact, one of the things that I did with the State Department is I trained our staff in Africa at all of our embassies in Africa using this same setup. And we went through the editorial processes and how to use the equipment. And that took about a week to train everybody from start to finish on how to create, manage, and manage a podcasting program. And so again, I just want to show you this picture to tell you that you don't need a whole lot of technology. You don't need a whole lot of hardware. A lot of this is available either for free or for low cost. Again, the first principle is to define who your audience is and how you want to engage with those people, because that will tell you the type of technology that you need. Okay, I'd like to move on now. We're about 8:21. Okay, so let me finish up here. Virtual programming is what I'm doing now. Now, virtual programming is essentially what we're doing now. We're using Zoom, and you're watching this on a webinar. Now, again, when we're talking about technology, there are so many options out there. You want to, again, start with the first principles, and then that will help you decide what type of technology and software that you need. Virtual programming is great for regular stakeholder engagement, and this is all about building relationships. And I'll get to the importance of that in just a second. The present pandemic and COVID-19 has really focused minds on why this is important. Any government or any public diplomacy program that is not engaging and building their capabilities for virtual programming right now is behind the curve, because this pandemic is just one example of things that will come in the future. If it's not a pandemic, it's a natural disaster, or it's possibly social unrest. Being able to engage with your stakeholders and build relationships remotely and in an engaging way with virtual programming is only going to become more important. So I would encourage all of you who are watching to look seriously into this and to build your capability and your processes and your ability to put together a good virtual programming resource. Again, this is a perfect example of a low resource and low cost activity with large potential impacts. You can go online right now and get a free Zoom account to start learning how to use it. So I would encourage everybody to look into that and look at best practices on how to manage a virtual program, the preparation, the actual execution, and then the follow-up. How are you dealing with your stakeholders? Now, one last thing I'd like to do before we get to questions is security issues in digital diplomacy. This is an information where a lot of attention is being focused right now. There's a lot of concern about disinformation and misinformation, for example. Zoom bombing, where you have people coming in unannounced and making lewd gestures or shouting information that is not wanted. There are security measures for each one of these platforms in virtual programming that you would want to look into. As a host, for example, on a Zoom call, I have the ability to kick anybody out who is disrupting the program at any time. So as you look into that and you're researching your virtual programming capability, look at the different options for keeping things safe, okay? Now, one of the papers that I actually provided as part of the resource is something that it's how to promote disinformation inoculation. Now, what that means is that as people get lots of information, they don't know exactly where it's coming from or whether it's true or not. The basic way that they're going to tell whether your messaging is good for them or legitimate is going to come back to their relationship with you. So, for example, if I see something from a source that says, well, the U.S. Embassy in South Africa said this, and it doesn't, I don't agree with that because I know those people, they would not say something like that. And so when I do have a relationship and I do understand the intent and the character and the integrity of the institution, that is the best way for people and your audiences to know what is legitimate and what is not. It all comes back to the relationships that you build with your audiences. And that's what the virtual programming and the technology allows you to do, especially in a face-to-face atmosphere like this. So there, I'd like to go ahead and stop and take any questions that you have. Again, you don't need to write this down. Everything that you've seen now is in the folder. So that's my contact information. I'm happy to answer any questions later. And you can contact me anytime, and go ahead and hook up with me on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to connect with you there. And let's have a discussion at this point. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sean. I think that was a powerful presentation, even as it advises simplicity. And there are a couple of questions and comments, and I'll try to post them to you. Do you want to take one at a time, or I give them all to you in one fell swoop?
Let's go ahead and take them one at a time. That would be easier, I think.
All right, so first one. Thanks for the great presentation. Can you elaborate on the editorial, I believe editorial policy you followed to develop the podcasts?
Absolutely.
And I think that's the first one, yeah.
Okay, yeah, the editorial process, whenever you're dealing in a formal professional environment, okay, let's just take government diplomacy offices, public diplomacy offices as an example. You want to make sure that you're getting the right message out, okay? And so in the case of the State Department, we took a lot of information that had already been written, it had already been cleared, and it was already on message. It agreed with the message of the administration that we were supporting. So that was easy for us. We simply took that and we adapted it for an audio context. And so and this is something in the resource folder, where in the podcasting document, the editorial process that we used is already in there. So you can take a look at that. The editorial process is important. You go from a sourcing step to a development step to a clearance step. And all of that happens before you do any recording or any actual audio production with the software. Because once you have actually developed and produced the content itself, it takes a lot of work to do that. A lot of times it's time consuming, especially if you're doing interviews and you're doing the editing and you have to do the mastering and arranging the music and all the audio files. You don't want to get to the end of the process and have a final audio file, show it to your leadership, and they say, oh no, that's not what we want. You have to go back to the beginning of the process. See, that's very inefficient and a waste of time. So the editorial process in that document, definitely make sure that you have something very solid in place so that when you get to the end of the production process, everything is exactly as expected, and your leadership is going to know that, yes, this is what I ordered. This is what we agreed on. That's a very important thing, because it can result in a lot of wasted time if there's miscommunication. So sourcing, development, approval, and then production. Those are the 4 steps right there.
All right, I think that is well received. The other kind of comment which can be converted into a question is, how do you target your audience? How do you define your audience?
Yeah, that's one of the things that is very important, like I said, is in the first principle. And it's something that is an ongoing process that is very, very important. Virtual programming and using Zoom and interactive technology like this is a great way to do it, because you can, not only can you source data points, you can look at news articles and see the trends and the demographics. Those are a lot of things that are publicly available. But one of the things that I found is most interesting is to actually use this virtual technology to interview your target audience. At the State Department, we work with a lot of American spaces overseas. And one of the things I did recently is I conducted a series of 12 interviews with American spaces in Africa and Latin America and in Europe. And we just sat down and had a conversation. I said, who is coming into your space? Are they students? Are they young professionals? What do they come there for? And just through a series of questions and engaging with your target audience and your stakeholders, you're able to gain a lot of insight into what they're looking for and how they access your messaging. So I would start there. Just start talking to some of the stakeholders, some of the people that you know, and put together a list of interview questions that cover some of the basics. You know, how old are they? Are they students? What type of information do they want? How are they accessing messaging? Is it on a mobile phone? Do they like to attend in-person events? Do they have access to the internet? All of those questions are going to give you insight into who your audience is and the technology and the training that you'll need to engage with them via technology.
I think the next question is a very logistical one, which is where are the resources? I think just to advise colleagues that we have shared this via Google Drive. And for those who have difficulties accessing those, we'll actually make them available. Just reach out to us, the organizers. And so the next question is, how do you measure impact? How do you get feedback on the messages that you send out or you've developed?
Okay, this again is something that is very interesting. With virtual programming, if you're going to a Facebook page, for example, you use the metrics within Facebook. You can go to Insights, and there you can see how many people have shared your post, how many people have watched your virtual program. Now, in a lot of cases, it's tougher. For example, when we were using podcasting to reach radio stations, we did not have an online facility to tell us how many people, you know, we're actually listening to the podcast. So again, this is where the stakeholder engagement and the relationship building comes in very, very handy. Is you need to be able to talk to people and say, okay, I sent this this audio file to your radio station. How many people do you have in your audience on a typical time frame? And so again, you can go ahead and access the data metrics if your technology allows you to do that. Okay, if you're connecting with your audience through the internet, there are different metrics and data points you can get to measure the impact. But if you are actually going to a partner who is gathering an audience for you, or if you're taking an audio file and sending it to a radio station, there's a disconnect there. The internet is no longer applicable. So you need to be able to talk to your stakeholders and interview them again to find out how many people are in their audience and what type of feedback that they're getting. I do want to make one final point on that. There's a difference between the quantitative feedback, which means the number of shares, how many views you had on a certain web page, and the qualitative feedback. The qualitative feedback means that I listened to it and I really liked it. You know, I actually took this radio station and this radio program and I recommended it to a friend. That type of information is also very important because it tells you about the quality of your programming and any changes you need to make in your editorial process or in your content production process.
Great. And the next question is, how could you, I think there's a colleague who wishes that you explain a little more about virtual programming. And I think I'll benefit from that as well, personally.
Okay, great. There are some great resources that I provided in the folder in terms of how we use virtual programming and the strategies, so I recommend you read that. There is so much that goes into it, it's kind of tough to know how to start. There's definitely a process in terms of putting together a virtual program. What we use a lot in the State Department and also with some of my other clients is we have a standard operating procedure. And so virtual programs are very much like event planning, okay? Just like you would do in a conference room, for example. So some of the key questions are, you know, who are your speakers? Okay, again, who is your audience? That's the first question you always want to start with is, who is your audience and what are they interested in hearing? Now, as far as when you've answered those questions, the virtual programming and the technology part of it, there's a lot that goes into that as well. So what platform are you going to use? Who is going to be the technical person? You always want to have at least one staff member who knows exactly how the software works. And this is important not only for the quality of your productions, but also for the security aspects that we talked about earlier. And so once you get into those processes, you'll get a better idea of how to manage a virtual program and also the follow-up as well. You know, how are you going to find out the success or failure of your virtual programming? And again, because we are using virtual program, Zoom, for example, Facebook, all of those metrics and data points are available. But again, it's important to engage with your stakeholders to be able to measure what the actual impact was in terms of, you know, the message that they received and how they received it, whether or not it was beneficial for them. It's a very important aspect to do, is the follow-up on that.
Okay, thanks. And so the next question is from Dabiseng, who would like to know, because the organization she works with okay, let me put it this way. The stockholders that they would like to reach are relatively mature, over 50 years, but they want to reach out to younger audiences of university students and young professionals. So how can she bridge this gap and cater to both mature and younger audiences without losing either?
Well, that's a good question. And again, that goes back to the first principle, is you need to find out what type of messaging and what type of information they're looking for. Now, something else you may want to consider as well is that with younger audiences, they are digital natives. You know, they grew up with this technology. So Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram and all these social media sites, especially the mobile phones, these are second nature to them. That you may run into problems with that when you're looking for an older audience who are still kind of learning this stuff when it comes to how to access that information. So I would start, you know, again, with the first principle. First of all, you know, what type of messaging do they want to hear? Because that may be different for older versus younger audiences. What is their technology capability? Okay, how are they going to, I mean, I think a lot of older audiences are going to be using a desktop computer like I'm using right now. A lot of younger audiences will have their headphones on and their phones, and they'll be watching your program on their phone like this. So in terms of finding out the technology that you need, you want to be able to have something that can go to both types of platforms if you want to reach both audiences at once. Now, for example, a Zoom call like this particular call we're on right now can be accessed on a desktop computer, on a tablet, or a phone. So if you wanted to do a virtual program, the technology for virtual programming does not present an obstacle. You can get to everybody that way. The real challenge that you face in that case with a different demographic is finding out what type of information they want, okay? And what is the format? Do they want it to be a big discussion, or do they want it to be a lecture? Because if an older audience would just like to sit and hear the information, a younger audience with a shorter attention span, they may get bored with that pretty quick and just leave. And so again, the consumer, our target audiences with so many technology options, they can go whenever they want. They are in charge. They are the ones that determine how they access your information. You have to follow them. You have to go where they are in terms of finding out what technology you're going to use. So that's a tough question, but again, it all comes down to the research and knowing your audience, I think.
Okay, so we are coming to about 2 minutes to time, but there are a couple of more interesting questions. So I think we'll try and squeeze them in before we go for the break, because it looks like we're having some energy here and some great interactions. So one is governments are very bureaucratic. How do you get to convince them to go with the new technologies when they are available?
Right. This is something, and again, when I started the podcasting program at the State Department, we did a lot of stakeholder engagement. It's a lot of education, and you need to present really an evidence-based case, I think, to tell people, okay, we want to get into podcasting, or we want to get into virtual programming. And anybody who is not familiar with the technology, in my experience, they tend to be a little shy about that. And so you do need to convince them. This is a long-term and an ongoing process, I believe. So you need to be able to look into your stakeholder engagement and find out, you know, what type of information they are looking for, and also find out and convince them what are going to be the benefits for them. Okay, so for example, when we were talking about podcasting in Africa, one of the main arguments I had is that these are high priority audiences for us. There's no other way we can reach them. They don't have internet access. The podcasting and the audio production process is the only way we can reach these people. And I can do it efficiently. I can do it in a way that is going to be ongoing and sustainable so that we can do it over the long term. Once I laid out that case and I said, you know, this is something that we need to do for those reasons, they came along and the technology, the fear of the technology kind of went away at that point. They were willing to go ahead and say, okay, let's give this a try. And then once we actually did it and they saw that it worked, then we were off and running. There was no problem after that. But that is a long-term process, and you need to be able to engage with them and demonstrate an understanding of what their concerns are first. And then only afterwards, then you bring in the technology. You know, start with the basic principle of this is how we're reaching these people and this is why we need to do this.
Okay, so I think we'll squeeze in two more questions, even though we have a short time. And one is, what type of challenges did you experience with participants, especially in regions that have poor internet connections or bandwidth capacities?
Right. That obviously this is a very limiting factor when you're dealing with things like social media and virtual programming. You know, in places where we have low internet connectivity, when we're working with virtual programming, we like to find partners that perhaps in the cities, for example, who do have good internet penetration, who do have access to the internet. And then we work with them and say, what are some of the ways that we can gather your audiences into a single space, for example? Now, with the pandemic, this is a problem, okay, because we don't want to have people gathering in tight spaces for health reasons. But that's one of the ways you can do that. Identify partners to say, and use them as a gathering point for your audiences. Now, for example, and now looking at podcasting, again, start with your audience research, and what we found with that was that, well, people are not accessing the internet, but they're listening to radio stations. And so we did not try to force people to come to the internet to reach our podcast. We adapted our processes and our technology setup to reach them. So we went to where they were. And so the technology allows us to be very efficient and have a really specific purpose with how we're producing that content. So again, use the technology, be creative with it, and adapt. Because there's so many options out there, there's always a way that you can adapt to reach a target audience, even when they don't have internet connections.
Okay, I think we have a couple of other questions, but I will just perhaps pose two questions and then we close it. The rest can be answered by Lauren directly and through ourselves, and we can make plans, as we say in South Africa. But I think this is important. The question of attacks and disinformation, misinformation, security, cyber security issues. There is a question on whether we should use free software or we should actually purchase particular softwares. But in any case, what's your advice on security in an atmosphere where diplomatic work is confidential and top security half the time?
Right, exactly. Those are very important questions. I would not use any sort of free software tools if you're going to be doing some sort of interaction with audiences where sensitive information is being discussed. That's something that you don't want to do. The free software that you look at, you can go ahead and put together a free Zoom account, for example. Now, the Zoom account, if you look at Zoom, there are different levels. You have a free account, you have a business level, enterprise level. Each one of those have different capabilities and features. As you pay more, you're getting more features. Now, Zoom has been very good about putting together new security protocols as they have seen Zoom bombing and some disruption. So that's coming along very quickly, and they're improving that a lot. Now, in terms of if you wanted to use technology for content production, okay, this is about audio production or image production. There are some free tools out there. For example, I'm going to put That is from me to everyone. Oh, sorry, this is for all panelists. Oh, anyway, there is a tool, a software tool called Audacity. If you just Google Audacity, it is a free, downloadable audio production software that you can put on a Mac or a PC. Now, once you've downloaded that, they do send you updates. Okay, that type of thing, the security protocols really don't apply to that because you're using it for audio production. You can download it onto your computer, and you can actually take your computer off the internet when you're doing audio production. So you're not connected. People can't reach you when you're not connected to the internet. So what I would do is take a look at the information that you are receiving. If it is sensitive, you want to keep that in-house. That's where the editorial process comes in. Okay, you want to make sure that the sourcing and the development and the clearance process stays in-house. Once all that is cleared, then you can move to the production process. And once you're done with your production process, whether it's text, video, or audio, or a virtual program, that's going to be public facing. But do all of your editorial process with all the security protocols before you're actually going to be doing any production that the public will see.
Okay, so I think I'm tempted to close it here, but just one very last one. And I think I'm trying to paraphrase this because it's a long comment. And the person who's asking the question wants to know if digital skills are becoming so important for every single diplomat, or is it only for those that are in the communication departments or units of diplomatic setup? Is there a suggestion that now almost every single diplomat must have digital skills?
I would say there's two parts to that answer. The first answer is that if you are in a public affairs or a public diplomacy discipline, doesn't matter if you're in government or business or nonprofit or what it is, you need to understand the strategic implications of how social media and how the technology is impacting what you're doing. This is, to me, this is something that is almost, it goes without saying, okay? If you're not familiar with how virtual programming is impacting how people are accessing your messaging, you're really behind the curve. So yes, if you are in a leadership position or a public affairs officer or something like this, you're not necessarily expected to know how to set up a Zoom call and how to manage a Zoom call from the technical standpoint. Okay, you have specialized technical people on your staff. That's their job. That's their job, is to use the editing software to set up a Zoom call and manage things from the technical side. But every diplomat in a public affairs and public diplomacy discipline needs to understand how this technology works, at least from a conceptual standpoint, and especially how their audiences are accessing it and using it themselves. That is, I can't stress that enough. That's just absolutely crucial. So yes, the answer to your question is yes. They need to know how it works.
All right. Thanks, Lauren. And if we were in a conduct physical space, we'll have given you a standing ovation. But
thank you.
I'm sure wherever we are happy with the presentation. We'll take a break of just 3 minutes to stretch, make you a cup of coffee or something, okay, and then return for the second session by Professor Corneliu Biola, who will be talking on matters to do with social media methods and tactics for e-diplomacy. And thanks again, Lauren. So in 3 minutes, we come back.
Great, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.